9 years after my son was declared dead at sea, he walked through my front door wearing a hospital band with another man's name. He was thin, shaking, and very much alive. Before I could touch him, he locked the door behind him. "Dad," he whispered, "she knows I escaped." I appreciate you being here with me tonight. Before we begin, one small thing. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone so completely that you stopped asking questions? Yes or no? And one word for how that turned out. I read every single one. A quick note of some details in this story have been shaped for narrative and reflection. The message at its core is what I hope stays with you. The dead don't knock. But something hit my front door 3 times on a Saturday morning in April. 28 minutes after my wife drove away to her garden club, and the sound went through me like a nail through wet wood. I set down my coffee. The house was quiet. The particular quiet of a home in Marblehead where the ocean hums through the walls even when every window is shut. I am 68 years old. I spent 40 years as a maritime structural engineer, and I have learned to trust the sounds a structure makes when something is wrong. The knocking was wrong. I opened the front door. The man on my porch was young, maybe 30, but he looked decades older. His head was half-shaved, and the stubble on the other side had grown out in uneven patches. His cheekbones pressed against skin that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. He was wearing a thin cotton hospital gown under a gray coat 2 sizes too large. And on his left wrist, there was a plastic hospital band. I knew his face. I knew it the way you know the face of someone you buried not in the ground, but in the ocean, 9 years ago, when the Coast Guard told me the current had taken him and there was nothing left to recover. "Cedric," my voice cracked on the second syllable. They recovered your—" He didn't let me finish. My son, Cedric Prescott, 31 years old, declared lost at sea at 22, pushed past me into the house, locked the deadbolt, and pressed his back against the door. His breathing was shallow and fast, like a man who had been running for hours. "Don't call anyone," he said. "Not the police, not the company, nobody." He moved to the living room window and checked the street through the curtain gap. Then the kitchen window. Then the side door. Every movement was precise and practiced. The routine of someone who had spent years checking exits. The hospital wristband read, "Patient 114-D" in bold block letters. The rest of the print too small to make out in the dim porch light. "My son has a name." Someone took it from him. "How long until she comes back?" he asked. I couldn't answer immediately. I was staring at his arms. When he reached for the curtain, his sleeve pulled back and I saw them, small, round scars running along the inside of both forearms. Dozens of them, evenly spaced. Needle marks. Not from an IV in a hospital bed. From something repeated, deliberate, and long. "Cedric, sit down. Let me call." "How long until she comes back?" He said it louder this time, and the desperation in his voice made the hair on my arms stand up. She was my wife. He wasn't asking about a stranger. I told him Lorraine would be at her garden club until noon. He looked at the kitchen clock, 9:32, and some of the tension left his shoulders, but not much. He went to the kitchen sink and drank directly from the faucet, cupping water into his mouth with both hands. I watched the knobs of his spine press through the hospital gown. He was 70 pounds lighter than the last time I had seen him. The kitchen smelled like the coffee I had been drinking, and something else now. Antiseptic. Institutional. The sharp chemical smell of a place designed to keep people still. And while my son drank water like a man crossing a desert, my mind did what an engineer's mind does. It started building a structure from the evidence in front of me. Lorraine Prescott, 65, my wife of 41 years. Acting CEO of Prescott Maritime Freight since Cedric's death was declared. She wore black for 3 full years after the memorial. She gave the eulogy twice, once at the service, Once at the shareholders' meeting, where she assumed stewardship of his controlling interest. She organized the annual wreath-laying at the harbor dock every April without fail. She hosted the Coast Guard liaison dinners. She wept on camera for a local news segment about families of the lost. How do you mourn a son for 9 years, when the woman sleeping beside you knows exactly where he is? The thought hit me before I had evidence for it. But it landed with the weight of something I had been refusing to feel for a very long time. 9 years of memorial wreaths. 9 years of her hand on my arm at the dock, squeezing at exactly the right moment. 9 years of perfect grief, performed for an audience that included me. Cedric turned off the faucet. Water dripped from his chin. He looked at me with eyes that were too old for his face, and then he grabbed my wrist. His fingers felt like wire wrapped in skin. His voice dropped below a whisper. She knows I escaped. Dad. She's the one who put me there. I turned his wrist over and read the name on the hospital band. Gerald Fitch. Date of birth, March 12, 1961. A man who would be 64 years old, 33 years older than my son. Who is Gerald Fitch? I asked. Cedric pulled his wrist back and held it against his chest, like something that had been burned. That's what they called me, he said. For 9 years. That's who I was. Below the wristband, the words Pinehaven Neurological Center were printed in small blue type. I had never heard the name. I pushed up his left sleeve and then his right. The needle scars ran in parallel rows along both forearms, evenly spaced. Dozens of them. Not the random marks of a hospital stay, but the evidence of something systematic, repeated over years. They injected me twice a day, Cedric said. His voice was flat, the tone of someone describing weather. Morning and evening, same time, same arm, rotating sides. I couldn't remember my own middle name until 6 months ago. 6 months. A nurse gave me the wrong dose, too low. Things started coming back. Your face first, then the house, then my name. He swallowed hard. I pretended I was still gone. I pretended for months, until I could plan a way out. I asked him how he escaped. He told me a night shift nurse left a fire door unlocked. He walked out at 3 a.m. in a hospital gown and a coat he stole from a supply closet. He hitchhiked to a bus station. He rode 3 buses across Massachusetts. He walked the last 4 miles from the Marblehead bus stop to our front door in shoes that didn't fit. Don't call the police, he said again. And this time, I heard something in his voice that stopped me cold. Not fear, but certainty. She has people inside the department. She has people everywhere. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that was impossible. That his mother couldn't have that kind of reach. That he was confused after years of whatever they had pumped into his veins. But I looked at the needle scars and the wristband with a dead man's name on it, and I didn't argue. 9 years of needles. 9 years of stolen identity. And I'd been arranging flowers on an empty grave. Take off the coat, I said. He looked at me, confused. The coat. Take it off. You stole it from the facility if they have any way to track you. It's in something you're wearing. Engineering instinct. When a structure fails, you trace the weakness to its source. Cedric shrugged the gray coat off his shoulders, and I caught it before it hit the floor. It was heavier than it should have been. I ran my fingers along the hem, then the lining. Near the left side seam, I felt something rigid, small, flat, hard-edged. I grabbed the kitchen scissors from the drawer and cut the lining open. A black disc the size of a shirt button fell into my palm. It had a tiny green LED on one side, and it was blinking. The green light pulsed against my skin like a second heartbeat. They already knew he was here. GPS tracker, I said. And my voice sounded calm in a way that had nothing to do with how I felt. It's been transmitting since you left. Cedric's face went white. They'll send people. They have a team. Orderlies, drivers, They'll come with paperwork. They'll say I'm a danger to myself. A judge signed something, a commitment order, under the name Gerald Fitch. They can take me back legally, and nobody would question it, because the paperwork says I'm a 64-year-old neurological patient who wandered off. I dropped the tracker into the kitchen sink and turned on the garbage disposal. The green light disappeared with a grinding shriek. Then I went to the front window and looked through the curtain. A white ambulance with no hospital markings had stopped 3 houses down. It was idling. The driver's side window was dark. As I watched, the rear doors swung open and 2 men stepped onto the sidewalk. One carried a clipboard. The other carried a small black case, the kind that holds syringes. They were already walking toward my house. "Garage," I said. "Now, we're taking the truck." I grabbed the keys off the hook by the kitchen door. Not the keys to the family SUV in the driveway, but the keys to the old Ford work truck I kept in the back of the garage from my years inspecting harbor docks. No GPS, no digital ignition, no connection to anything Lorraine could trace. Cedric moved fast despite his weakness, and I pushed him through the kitchen toward the garage door. Behind us, through the front window. The 2 men in white scrubs reached the walkway and turned toward our porch. I pulled the garage door shut behind us, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the keys twice. I hit the garage light and moved straight to the family SUV. Instinct check the vehicle before you drive it. I crouched beside the rear wheel well and saw it immediately. A black disc the size of a quarter, magnetic mounted to the frame. Its green LED blinking in the dark. They hadn't just tracked the coat. They had wired my car. How long had that been there? Weeks? Months? Had Lorraine's people been watching where I drove, the grocery store, the bank? The harbor for the entire 9 years my son was locked in a room under someone else's name. I left the SUV where it sat and pulled the tarp off the truck in the back corner of the garage. A 2004 Ford F-150. Unregistered since I retired. No GPS, no Bluetooth. No digital ignition. Just a key and an engine that started on the 3rd try, with a cough of diesel smoke. I had used it for harbor dock inspections before I left the company. It smelled like salt and motor oil and a decade of dust. "Get in," I told Cedric. He was already moving. I backed out through the alley behind the house while the 2 men in scrubs knocked on the front door. Through the rearview mirror, I watched one of them cup his hands against the side light window and peer inside. The other spoke into a phone. "They'll call her the second they find the house empty," Cedric said. "Then we don't have long." I turned onto Elm Street and headed north toward Route 127. The morning was bright, and ordinary joggers on the sidewalk, a woman walking a golden retriever, a mailman sorting envelopes on someone's porch. None of them had any idea that the old truck passing by contained a dead man and the father who was trying to keep him alive. Cedric sat with his hands pressed between his knees. The tremor had gotten worse since we left the house. His body was metabolizing whatever they had been pumping into him, and the withdrawal was starting to show. "Who is Holloway?" I asked. "The doctor, the one who runs the facility, Dr. Eris Holloway." Cedric said the name the way you say the name of a disease. "He controlled everything. The doses, the schedule, who got to see me, which was nobody. And your mother, she pays him. She visits once a month. She brought flowers once." His voice cracked on the last word. "Flowers! Like she was visiting a grave." I kept my eyes on the road and my hands at 10 and 2, because if I looked at my son right now, I would pull over and I would not be able to start driving again. We were 20 minutes onto Route 127 when I checked the mirror and saw a black SUV 4 car lengths back. It had been there since the Marblehead town line. No front plate. I slowed. It slowed. I changed lanes. It changed lanes. The license plate frame on the rear was empty, not a plate removed, but screw holes that had never been drilled, factory sealed. This vehicle had never been registered. "Hold on," I said. "I know a cut-through past the old docks." I turned hard right onto an unmarked service road behind the Chandler-Hovey docks, a route I had driven hundreds of times during my years inspecting harbor infrastructure. The road was gravel, narrow, and invisible from the highway unless you already knew it was there. The F-150 bounced over ruts, and I heard Cedric grab the door handle. In the mirror. The black SUV overshot the turn. Its brake lights flared red, but by then I was already behind a row of storage containers and out of sight. I cut through the boat launch access road, looped back onto Route 127 a half-mile north, and merged into traffic heading toward Gloucester. Cedric watched the mirror for 2 full minutes before he spoke. "There are more of them," he said. "Holloway has drivers, orderlies, people who do whatever he says. Some of them used to be patients themselves. He gets them clean, and then they owe him." "How many times have you tried to get out?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. 3 times. Once through a window, once through a laundry cart. Once I made it to a gas station and called 911. He paused. The police brought me back to the facility. They said I was a confused patient who had wandered off. The paperwork matched. Holloway met them at the door. He pressed his forehead against the passenger window and said it quietly. Like a fact, he had stopped fighting. "They always find me, Dad. Every single time." His hand drifted to the needle scars on his forearm, tracing them the way a man counts the days he has lost. 3 escape attempts. 3 failures. Police had delivered my son back to his captors like a lost package returned to sender. But this time was different. This time he had reached me, and I was not going to let anyone send him back. The boathouse smelled exactly the way it did. 12 years ago, diesel, salt rot, and creosote. But the son standing beside me was supposed to be at the bottom of the Atlantic. I pulled the truck around the back of the building and parked it behind a row of rusted crab traps where it couldn't be seen from the road. The boathouse at Gloucester Harbor was a structure I had inspected for the company over a decade ago, condemned. Delisted from the corporate inventory in 2014, forgotten by everyone except me. "Nobody knows about this place," I told him. "Not the company, not your mother, not anyone who would think to look." Cedric made it through the side door and collapsed onto a canvas tarp in the corner. The shaking had gotten worse. His jaw was clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. And sweat had soaked through the hospital gown, despite the cold air coming off the harbor. Withdrawal. Whatever they had been putting into his veins, his body was screaming for more of it. I found a moving blanket in the truck bed and wrapped it around his shoulders. Then I blocked the entrance with 2 lengths of scrap lumber, sat down on an overturned crate across from him, and waited. He started talking without being asked. "I didn't drown, Dad." I already knew that he was sitting in front of me, but hearing him say it out loud was different. It made the 9 years real in a way that seeing his face at the front door hadn't. A fishing trawler pulled me out of the water 40 minutes after the yacht went down. I was conscious. I was calling for help. They pulled me onto the deck and I thought I was saved. 40 minutes. My son was floating in the Atlantic for 40 minutes, and someone pulled him out and handed him to the people who made him disappear. "The trawler didn't take me to a hospital," he continued. "They radioed someone. A van was waiting at the dock when we came in. 2 men in scrubs put me on a stretcher and drove me to a facility in the mountains. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know anything for a long time after that." "Pine Haven," I said. He nodded. "They told me my name was Gerald Fitch. They told me my family had committed me because I was a danger to myself. I didn't believe them at first. But after a few weeks of the injections, I couldn't remember enough to argue." He pulled the moving blanket tighter. The boathouse creaked around us, wind off the harbor pushing through gaps in the siding. The sound of water lapping against the pilings underneath. Outside. Gloucester Harbor went about its Saturday business. Boats motored past, gulls screamed. The world kept turning while my son told me how his had been stopped. "The first 3 years I don't remember at all," he said. White walls, the taste of metal on my tongue. A man's voice telling me when to eat, when to sleep, when to hold out my arm. That's all I had. Holloway. Dr. Holloway. He ran everything. He decided the dosages, the schedule, who entered my room, what I ate. I never saw another patient. I never saw a window. I didn't know if it was day or night unless someone turned the lights on. 3 years with no memory. I was laying wreaths at the harbor while my son couldn't remember his own name in a room 2 hours west of where I stood every April with my head bowed. 6 months ago. Something changed, Cedric said. The dose was wrong, too low. A new nurse, maybe, I don't know. But things started coming back. Your voice first, then the house, then the harbor. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw the 22-year-old he had been. Sharp, stubborn. The kid who used to argue with me about hull stress calculations at the dinner table. I pretended I was still gone, he said. For 6 months. I played the patient they wanted me to be. I ate when they said. I held out my arm. I stared at the wall. And every night, after the lights went out, I planned. How long have you been lucid? I asked. How long have you known who you are? His eyes went flat, the look of a man deciding how much truth the other person can survive. Long enough to find out who signed the intake papers, he said. Cedric rolled up his left sleeve past the needle scars and showed me what he had carved into his own skin with a paperclip. 4 characters scratched into the inner forearm in jagged, uneven strokes, 114D. My room number, he said. I did it during a lucid window 3 years ago. I was afraid the drugs would erase even the knowledge that I was a prisoner. So I wrote it on the one thing they couldn't take from me. I touched the scar with my fingertip. The skin was raised and rough, healed over in the way that self-inflicted marks heal badly, permanently, without care. My son had carved a message into his own flesh because he could not trust his own mind to remember where he was. Every time I started to come back, they knew. Cedric continued. Within 2 days, sometimes less, the dosage went up. I'd feel myself getting sharper, remembering more. And then, one morning, the injection would hit different, heavier, and I'd be gone again. Someone was watching you. Someone was measuring me. Cognitive tests every week, disguised as routine checkups. How many fingers? What day is it? What's your name? If I answered too quickly. If I showed too much recognition. The report went to Holloway and the dose climbed. They were calibrating how much of me to erase. He carved a room number into his own flesh with a paperclip because he was afraid the drugs would erase even the knowledge that he was a prisoner. I sat with that thought until it stopped being a sentence and became a weight I could feel in my chest. There's something else, Cedric said. He reached into the waistband of the hospital pants. The elastic was shot. The fabric stained and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. It was small, torn along one edge, creased from being pressed flat against skin. He handed it to me with the care of a man handing over the only proof he exists. I unfolded it. The top half was letterhead, Pine Haven Neurological Center, with an address in the rural Berkshires. Below that, a partial pharmaceutical label had been taped to the page. Lorazepam compound, custom titration, Dr. A. Holloway. Followed by a dosage number and a patient code. This is all I could take, Cedric said. I hid it in my cheek during a bed check the night I ran. I held it there for 4 hours until I was clear of the building. I turned the paper over. On the back, someone had written a date in blue ink 9 years ago. The week after the yacht accident, the intake date. The day my son stopped being Cedric Prescott and became a number in a file. That scrap of paper weighed almost nothing in my hand. It was the heaviest thing I had ever held. Holloway, I said. The doctor's name, A. Holloway. What's the A? Eris. Dr. Eris Holloway. He runs the whole place. The staff, the drugs, the records. Nobody moves without his approval. And your mother? Cedric's jaw tightened. The tremor in his hands got worse for a moment. Then he forced it still. He answers to her, he said. She visits once a month. She checks the reports, she signs the payments. Howey does what she tells him to do because she's the one who writes the checks. I looked at the letterhead again. Pine Haven Neurological Center. A Berkshire's address. A doctor named Eris Holloway, who had kept my son chemically erased for nearly a decade on my wife's instructions. I folded the paper carefully along its original creases, placed it in my breast pocket, and buttoned the pocket shut. Something had changed inside me. Not broken, I think. That had happened hours ago, before at the front door. This was different. The grief was still there, but it had gone quiet. The way a furnace goes quiet when the thermostat clicks over to a different setting. What replaced it was colder and more precise. Dad, Cedric said. What are you going to do? I looked at my son. He was shaking under the moving blanket, his carved forearm resting on his knee, his eyes clear for the first time since he had walked through my door. He had survived 9 years of chemical imprisonment by scratching messages into his own skin and hiding scraps of paper in his mouth. He had done everything a human being could do to hold on to himself. Now it was my turn. I find Holloway, I said. I find the truth, and I bring all of it down. I knew I could not do it alone. I needed someone who could read a pharmaceutical label the way I read a structural blueprint, someone with the skills to trace a compound and the loyalty to keep quiet about why. I knew exactly one man who fit that description. The man I needed was not the chemist, not yet. First, I needed the investigator. I bought a prepaid phone from a gas station on Route 128 and dialed a number I hadn't used in 9 years. The one man who told me, at the funeral that wasn't a funeral, that the drowning never made sense. Boyd Redmond picked up on the second ring. It's Wallace Prescott, I said. My son is alive. Silence. Then a single breath, slow and controlled, the kind a man takes when something he has been carrying for a very long time suddenly gets lighter. Where do you want to meet? He asked. I told him the Harbor Diner in Gloucester. The one with the back booth by the kitchen where the fishermen sit when they don't want to be overheard. He said he would be there in 14 minutes. I believed him. Boyd Redmond was 62, a former Coast Guard investigator with a square jaw and a permanent squint earned from 3 decades on open water. He had handled the original disappearance case, my son's case, and he was the one who had pulled me aside after the memorial service and said, quiet enough that nobody else heard, that the current patterns didn't match the timeline. I had been too deep in grief to listen. He had been too junior to push back against his supervisor. The case closed. Boyd retired 3 years later. He was already in the back booth when I arrived, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him. The diner smelled like frying oil and salt cod, and the television above the counter was playing a Red Sox game that nobody was watching. I sat down across from him and told him everything. Cedric at the front door, the wristband, the needle marks, the false name, the facility in the Berkshires, Lorraine. Boyd listened without interrupting. When I finished, he reached under the table and lifted a battered cardboard file box onto the seat beside him. It was the size of a milk crate, held together with packing tape, and it had clearly been opened and closed hundreds of times. He had kept that box in his trunk for 9 years. Not his attic, not a storage unit, his trunk. Like a man who expected the call to come any day. I've been carrying this since the day they made me close the file, Boyd said. 9 years of notes, Coast Guard logs, weather data, current charts. I kept copies of everything in violation of federal records policy because the case never sat right. You signed the report, I said. You signed off on the drowning. I signed it because my supervisor ordered me to. A man named Driscoll, since retired. He told me the evidence was conclusive and the family needed closure. Boyd's jaw tightened. I never believed it. Not for one day. He opened the file box and pulled out a stack of documents held together with a binder clip. On top was a Coast Guard technical report I had never seen, a supplemental analysis of the yacht's emergency systems. "This is what haunted me," Boyd said. He laid the document flat on the table and pointed to a timestamp circled in red marker. "The yacht's EPIRB, the emergency position indicating radio beacon. Standard equipment on every vessel that size. It sends an automatic distress signal the moment the boat takes on water or capsizes." "I know what an EPIRB is." "Then you know it doesn't turn itself off." He tapped the circled timestamp. "The beacon was manually deactivated at 14:22. The Mayday call didn't come until 15:01. That's a 39-minute gap. Someone switched off the distress signal before your son ever went into the water. Who deactivates a distress beacon on a boat carrying her own son unless she already knows he won't need rescuing?" The question formed in my mind with the precision of a structural calculation. And the answer was already there, waiting. "Who had access to the yacht that morning?" I asked. Though part of me already knew. According to the marina log, only 2 people boarded before departure. Boyd reached into the file box and pulled out a photocopied page. He slid it across the table and tapped the second signature line with his index finger. 2 signatures. The first was Cedric's, loose, young, the handwriting of a 22-year-old who thought he was going sailing. The second was Lorraine's. Neat. Familiar. The same handwriting I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the eulogy she read at his memorial. I stared at my wife's signature on the marina log, and felt something inside me go permanently quiet. "I waited 9 years for someone to believe me, Wallace," Boyd said. 9 years. The coffee in front of him had gone cold. Neither of us had touched it. Outside the diner window, Gloucester Harbor was turning dark, and somewhere in a boathouse on its shore, my son was waiting for me to come back with a reason to believe this time would be different. I spread Boyd's files across the diner table and looked at the accident report the way I should have looked at it 9 years ago, not as a grieving father, but as a structural engineer. The Coast Guard technical supplement included a diagram of the yacht's EPIRB unit. Standard marine installation battery pack. Antenna housing. Activation pin. Hydrostatic release. The report noted the beacon was found in deactivated mode and attributed it to a probable malfunction. Boyd had flagged it. His supervisor had buried the flag. But I had installed EPIRB systems on Prescott Maritime vessels for 20 years. I knew what a malfunction looked like, and this wasn't it. "The activation pin was pulled," I said, tracing the diagram with my finger. "See this? The circuit wasn't corroded or shorted. It was interrupted, a clean, single-stroke cut through the lead wire. You'd need a pair of wire snips in about 30 seconds. Boyd leaned forward. "You're saying someone who understood the system could do this quickly, before departure? Someone who had watched a maintenance check? Someone who sat through the briefing and paid attention to which wire did what?" I set the diagram down and looked at Boyd across the table. "I ran those briefings for every vessel in the Prescott fleet. Lorraine attended every single one. She said she wanted to understand the business." The words landed between us like something dropped from a height. "She sat through every maintenance briefing I ever gave. I taught my own wife how to disable the one device that could have saved our son." Boyd didn't say anything for a long time. The diner had emptied around us. It was past 8, and the fishermen had gone home. The television above the counter was running local news with the sound off. "This is enough to reopen the investigation," Boyd said finally. "But we need to move fast. How long do we have before she realizes you know?" "I don't know. Her retrieval team found an empty house this morning. She'll assume Cedric is running. Not that I'm helping him. That buys us some time." "How much time?" I didn't have an answer. Boyd drove me back to the boathouse, and I told him I would call him in the morning. He handed me the file box through the truck window. "Take all of it," he said. "I've been waiting to give this to someone who could use it." I carried the box inside. Cedric was asleep on the tarp, the moving blanket pulled over his head, his breathing shallow but steady. The withdrawal tremors had settled into something lower, a faint vibration in his fingers that didn't stop even in sleep. I sat on the overturned crate and pulled out the burner phone. There was one more call I needed to make. Not to a chemist, not to a lawyer, but to someone who could tell me how much time I actually had. Doris Caldwell picked up on the fourth ring. She was a Suffolk County courthouse clerk I had known since the early days of Prescott Maritime, when I spent half my life filing dock permit applications. She was 70 now, sharp as a tack, and she owed me a favor from a zoning dispute I had helped her nephew navigate in 2019. Doris, I need to know about a pending petition. Prescott absent death filing. When is the final hearing? A pause. I heard her chair creak and the sound of a keyboard. Thursday, she said. 9 a.m., Judge Whitfield's docket. Petitioner is Lorraine Prescott. Once the order is signed, the estate transfer is irreversible without a full civil suit. You're looking at 2 years minimum to challenge it after that. 5 days. After 9 years of waiting, the law was about to declare my living son permanently dead in 5 days. I thanked Doris and hung up. Then I stood and walked to the boathouse wall. Bare plywood, water-stained, smelling of creosote and harbor rot, and scratched a timeline in pencil directly onto the wood. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. 5 days to gather evidence, find a lawyer, build a case, and stop a transfer worth $42 million. 5 days to prove that the woman I had trusted for 4 decades had engineered the disappearance of our son, paid for his chemical imprisonment, and was now positioning herself to inherit everything he was supposed to own. Thursday morning. If I failed, Cedric Prescott would cease to exist on paper permanently. I looked at my son sleeping on the floor of a condemned boathouse, and I made a decision that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the fact that he had carved his own room number into his arm to remember he was real. I was not going to let Thursday come. 5 days meant I could not afford to sleep, but Cedric's body had made the decision for him. He was out on the tarp, the moving blanket rising and falling in shallow rhythm. While he slept, I opened my laptop and logged into an account my wife had never known existed. I had set it up in 2009 during a rough patch in our marriage. One of those quiet seasons where trust erodes without either person saying the word out loud. 2 maritime structural patents I had filed that year generated modest royalties, and instead of depositing them into our joint checking point, I routed them to a private brokerage account under my name alone. A safety net. A lifeboat I never expected to need. I had built that lifeboat out of distrust 10 years ago. Now I was climbing into it. The balance showed $41,000 in liquid assets. Not a fortune, but enough to operate on cash for 5 days without touching any account Lorraine could monitor. No joint checking, no credit cards, no digital trail. I initiated a withdrawal to a prepaid debit card I could pick up at any branch and closed the laptop. Cedric stirred but didn't wake. The boathouse creaked in the wind, and through the gaps in the siding I could see Gloucester Harbor under a half moon, the water black and still, the navigation buoys blinking in the distance. Boyd arrived at first light on Sunday morning. He carried a second file box, smaller than the first, held together with rubber bands. Inside were Prescott Maritime Freight financial summaries, quarterly reports he had subpoenaed during the original investigation, but never fully analyzed because his supervisor shut the case before the numbers could be traced. I never got to follow the money, Boyd said, setting the box on an upturned crate. They closed me out before I could match the financial records to the timeline. We spread the documents across the boathouse floor and worked through them page by page. It took 2 hours. I read financial statements the way I read structural schematics, looking for the load-bearing elements, the points where stress concentrates, the place where the design breaks. The break was on page 14 of the third quarterly report. A recurring line item: crew medical consulting. $60,000 a month, every month, for 9 consecutive years. The crew's health insurance is handled by Mariner Mutual, Boyd said, running his finger down the vendor list. Separate contract, separate vendor, separate line item. This consulting fee goes to a completely different payee. I pulled the vendor registration page. The payee was listed as Pinehaven Neurological Services, LLC, registered to a rural address in the Berkshires. 108 consecutive monthly payments. I did the math without needing a calculator, the kind of arithmetic that stays clean when the numbers are horrifying. Over $6 million drained from the company my father built, routed through a phantom consulting line, and delivered to the facility that held my son. $6.48 million to pay for a prison that held my son in a room with no windows while I arranged memorial wreaths on a dock 30 miles away. Someone had to authorize these payments, I said. Every month, someone on the board had to co-sign. We'll get to that, Boyd said. But look at this first. He pulled out a printed map, the kind you get from an online search, with the route highlighted in blue. The Berkshire's address, Pinehaven Neurological Center. He circled it with a pen and drew a line east toward Gloucester. 2.5 hours, he said. That's all. If we leave now, we can see it before anyone knows we're looking. I stared at the circled address. 2.5 hours. The place that had stolen 9 years of my son's life was close enough to drive to before lunch. I had probably driven past the exit on the turnpike dozens of times, heading to conferences in Albany, to client meetings in the Berkshires, to a weekend bed and breakfast Lorraine and I visited the year after Cedric's memorial. She had booked that trip. She had chosen the location. I wondered now if she had visited the facility on the way. I looked at Cedric, still asleep in the corner, and then back at the map. Not yet, I said. We go to the facility without evidence and we tip them off. They move Cedric's records, they clean the rooms, and we have nothing. I need the drug analysis first. And I need a lawyer who can turn all of this into a court filing before Thursday. Boyd folded the map and put it in his jacket. Then we better move fast. 4 days. 4 days. The pencil marks on the boathouse wall were already 1 day shorter. Before we could approach the facility or the law, we needed to know who we were dealing with. Boyd opened his laptop on the crate beside the file box, tethered to his phone's hotspot, and typed the name into the State Medical Board database. Eris Holloway, MD. The screen filled with red flags before he even hit the second page. Revoked in Pennsylvania. 2013, Boyd read aloud. Experimental sedative protocols administered to elderly dementia patients without informed consent. 3 patients suffered permanent cognitive damage. The facility, a private care home outside Philadelphia, settled with all 3 families before criminal charges could be filed. He scrolled further. No prosecution, no jail time. The settlement included non-disclosure agreements. Holloway surrendered his Pennsylvania license voluntarily as part of the deal, then applied for reinstatement in Massachusetts under a provisional status. Got it in 2015. 1 year before Cedric disappeared, I said. 1 year exactly. I stood up and walked to the boathouse door. The harbor was bright outside, Sunday afternoon sun cutting across the water. Sailboats tacking in the distance. A normal day for everyone who wasn't standing in a condemned building reading about a disgraced doctor who destroyed the minds of helpless people for a living. What kind of woman searches for a doctor who has already been caught drugging helpless patients and hires him specifically because of it? The answer was the kind of woman who needed someone compromised. Someone who could never go to the authorities because his own record would bury him. Someone who would do exactly as he was told because he had nowhere else to go. Lorraine hadn't just found Holloway. She had selected him the way an engineer selects a material for its specific properties under pressure. She didn't just find a doctor, I said. Turning back to Boyd, she found one nobody would believe if he talked. A man with a revoked license. A settlement he can't discuss. And 0 credibility in any courtroom. He's not her partner. He's her tool. Boyd closed the laptop. A man with that background running a private facility in the middle of the Berkshires that's not a medical practice? That's a hiding place. I woke Cedric. He came up slowly from sleep, blinking, the withdrawal tremor still visible in his fingers. I gave him water and sat down across from him. I need you to tell me everything you remember about the facility, I said. Layout, staff, routines, anything. His memories came in fragments. The drugs had seemed to that. He remembered fluorescent lighting that never turned off. A corridor with 6 doors, only 2 of which he ever saw opened. Orderlies who rotated in 12-hour shifts, always in pairs. A meal schedule that never varied. A yard he was allowed into once a week, surrounded by a concrete wall too high to see over. And then he said something that changed the shape of everything. There was another locked room down the hall. I leaned forward. Another patient. I never saw them. But I heard crying through the wall, a woman's voice, always at night, sometimes screaming. The orderlies would go in and it would stop. A woman's voice through a concrete wall, crying in the dark. My son had listened to that for years and couldn't even remember why it made him sad. When I started getting lucid, they moved her. Cedric continued. I heard the gurney wheels in the corridor. After that, the room was empty. But the lock stayed on the door. Boyd and I looked at each other. The silence in the boathouse was heavy. The kind of silence that comes when a problem you thought you understood suddenly doubles in size. There was a second locked door at the end of the corridor, Cedric added. The orderlies guarded it on rotation. I never saw what was behind it. If there's a second patient, Boyd said quietly. This isn't a personal vendetta anymore. It's organized. Holloway isn't just doing a favor for your wife. He's running an operation. I looked at my son. He was sitting up now, the moving blanket around his shoulders, his eyes clearer than they had been yesterday. The withdrawal was still working through him. But beneath it, something steadier was emerging, the intelligence that the drugs had tried to erase. Then we're not just saving Cedric, I said. We're shutting the whole thing down. Boyd nodded slowly. But we can't go to state police with a theory and some financial records. We need proof that place still exists, that it's still operating, and that there are people inside. We need the drug analysis, we need a lawyer, and we need all of it before Thursday. 4 days left on the boathouse wall. And the case had just gotten bigger than my family. The second captive changed everything. A woman none of us had ever seen. Locked behind a door my son heard screaming through for years that meant Holloway wasn't just following Lorraine's instructions. He was running a business. But knowing that didn't change the math. We had 4 days, and every piece of evidence we'd gathered so far was a copy, a printout, or a memory. We needed the originals. Digital records can be erased with a keystroke. Bank statements can be challenged as fabrications. Even Boyd's Coast Guard file was technically stolen, inadmissible before any judge who followed the rules. The only documents that would survive a courtroom challenge were the ones Lorraine kept in hard copy. That meant the forged identity paperwork that turned my son into Gerald Fitch. The invoices bearing a board member's signature authorizing the monthly payments. And the share transfer filings she needed to complete before Thursday's hearing. Without those originals, a competent attorney would shred our case in an afternoon. Her private office, I said. 2nd floor, northeast corner. That's where she keeps the physical files. She never trusted cloud storage, not after the company's server breach in 2019. Everything critical goes into the filing cabinet behind her desk. Boyd pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and spread it on the crate between us. It was a building permit diagram, public record, downloaded from the city planning database. Prescott Maritime Freight Headquarters, Atlantic Wharf, Boston. 4 floors, 2 stairwells, a loading dock on the harbor side, and a lobby monitored by 3 cameras feeding a security desk manned around the clock. Security rotation, Boyd said, tracing the layout with his finger. 2 guards on weeknights, one at the desk, one on patrol. Patrol does a floor-by-floor sweep every 90 minutes, starting at the top. That gives us a window on the second floor, but it's tight. 3 men in a rotting boathouse planning a burglary of a building I had helped design. The structural blueprints of my own career turned into a heist map. 40 years of load calculations and beam specifications. And now the most important thing I knew about that building was which door had a weak lock. "There's a service hall behind the loading dock," Cedric said. His voice was steadier than it had been yesterday. The withdrawal was still grinding through him, but his eyes were focused. His hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee Boyd had made on the camp stove. "I used to sneak in through it when I was 16. It runs behind the freight elevator shaft and connects to the east stairwell on the second floor. If the lock hasn't been changed, it bypasses every camera in the lobby." I looked at my son. He was describing a route he had used as a teenager to meet friends after hours in the warehouse. Back when the company was his playground, and his inheritance felt like a certainty rather than a weapon someone had turned against him. That corridor was part of the original 1987 construction. I had reviewed the drawings myself when we expanded the loading dock in 2003. "The lock is a Schlage commercial deadbolt," I said. "Standard on all service entries. The building manager replaces lobby hardware every 5 years. But the service corridors haven't been updated since the 2003 renovation. 22 years on the same lock." Boyd nodded. "Can you pick it up?" "I don't need to pick it. I still have the master key. They never asked for it back when I retired." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Boyd exhaled through his nose and wrote something on the margin of the permit diagram. "My 16-year-old son used to sneak into that building for fun. Now my 31-year-old son was planning to sneak in to save his own life." We spent the next hour working through the details. Entry through the service corridor at 11:15, after the first patrol sweep passed the second floor. Cedric would wait in the stairwell as a lookout while Boyd and I went to the office. I knew the filing cabinet, a 4-drawer steel case behind the mahogany desk, keyed separately from the office door. The key for that one I didn't have. Boyd said he could handle it with a tension wrench and a rake pick in under 2 minutes. We would photograph everything in place before removing any documents. If Lorraine noticed files missing, we needed proof of what the cabinet contained before she could claim we had planted evidence. Boyd would carry the originals. I would carry the copies. If we got separated, at least one set would survive. Boyd set down his pen and looked at both of us. The harbor wind pushed through the gaps in the boathouse wall, carrying the smell of diesel and salt. "If we get caught inside that building after hours," he said, "we become the criminals. Everything we've gathered becomes inadmissible. She wins by default." The tide was shifting outside. I could hear it pulling at the pilings beneath us, the low groan of wood adjusting to the water's new direction. "Monday night," I said. "We go Monday night." The decision settled over us like ballast in a hull heavy, low, and irreversible. Boyd had driven back to his motel to gather his tools for tomorrow night, and the boathouse went quiet. Cedric and I walked out onto the dock behind the building and sat down on the splintered planks, with our legs hanging over the black water of Gloucester Harbor. For the first time in 9 years, I heard my son breathe without shaking. The harbor was still. A quarter moon hung low over the breakwater, throwing a band of silver across the surface that bent with each small wave. Somewhere out past the channel markers, a lobster boat's running light drifted south. The air smelled like creosote and kelp and the faint sweetness of rain moving in from the east. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said yet. 9 years of conversations that never happened stacked up between us like debt. I broke first. "I should have looked harder," I said. "I should have questioned the report, questioned her, questioned everything. The EPIRB data was public. Any engineer could have pulled it and seen the same anomaly Boyd found. I had the training, the access, and the reason. And I did nothing." The words tasted like rust. I had spent my career analyzing structural failures, finding the crack that started the collapse, the weld that didn't hold, the load that exceeded the margin. I was the man people called when a ship broke apart and nobody could explain why. And when my own son's boat went down, I accepted the explanation my wife handed me without ever looking at the data. I trusted her. That was the failure. Not a structural failure or an engineering failure, a failure of judgment so complete that it functioned as complicity. For 9 years, I laid flowers at a memorial stone every April while my son carved a room number into his own arm with a bent paperclip, trying to remember he was real. "You didn't fail me." "Dad," Cedric said. I looked at him. The moonlight caught the scar tissue on his forearm, the crude numbers still visible beneath the sleeve he had pushed up. "She fooled everyone," he continued. "The Coast Guard, the board, the attorneys. She fooled herself into believing she deserved what she took. That's not your fault. That's her talent. It's not a talent. It's a sickness. Maybe. But you're the one sitting on this dock right now. You're the one who didn't call the police when I showed up. Didn't hand me over to the ambulance. Didn't do any of the things a normal person would do. You listened. That's not failure." He pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them. The tremor was still there in his fingers. The withdrawal would take weeks, the doctors would eventually tell us. But his voice had steadied. Something had shifted since the boathouse planning session. The frightened man who had appeared on my doorstep 2 nights ago was receding. And underneath him was someone harder. Someone who had survived things that should have destroyed him and was choosing to fight instead of run. "When the drugs were at their worst," Cedric said quietly, "I couldn't remember my own name. Couldn't remember the boat, couldn't remember the ocean, couldn't remember Mom's face. All of that was just white noise. But I could see your hands." I didn't move. "Your hands on the rail of the Marblehead dock. The summer I was 12, when you taught me to read tide charts. You were gripping the rail and pointing at the channel markers, and the sun was behind you. And I could see the calluses on your palms. That image never went away. Not once in 9 years." He paused. "When the dosage error happened and things started coming back, that was the first real memory. Your hands. That's what told me I had a father. And a name. And a life outside that room." The harbor water lapped against the pilings beneath us. I put my hand on the back of his neck and held it there, and neither of us said anything else for a while. Then, headlights swept across the gravel road behind the boathouse. Boyd's truck. The engine idled, low and rough, and the headlights cut 2 white lines across the dock where we sat. I stood up and helped Cedric to his feet. His legs were unsteady, but he held my arm only for a moment before letting go. "Stay inside," I told him. "Lock the door. If we're not back by dawn, call the number I left on the table. It's a maritime attorney named Otis Langley. Tell him everything." Cedric looked at me. His eyes were clear. "Come back! Dad!" "I came back for you," I said. "I'm not stopping now." I squeezed his shoulder once, turned, and walked toward the truck without looking back. Because if I looked back, I knew I wouldn't be able to leave. Boyd didn't speak when I climbed into the truck. He pulled away from the boathouse with the headlights off until we reached the main road, then drove south toward Boston in silence. I didn't look in the mirror. I couldn't afford to think about the dock, or my son's face, or the tremor in his voice when he said those 2 words. The security panel I designed in 2003 still used the same 6-digit maintenance override I had built into the system as an engineering failsafe. A backdoor for emergency diagnostics that bypassed the main alarm without triggering a log entry. Lorraine never changed it because she never knew it existed. I had buried it inside a 200-page construction report that nobody on the board ever read. 22 years later. That buried paragraph was the key to her front door. We parked 2 blocks east of the waterfront at 2:10. The building rose against the harbor sky, 4 stories of reinforced concrete and glass that I had helped spec from foundation bolts to roof membrane. Boyd stayed in the truck with binoculars and a handheld radio tuned to Channel 9. "You've got a clean street," his voice crackled through my earpiece. "No movement front or east side. Go!" I crossed the loading dock on foot. Stay close to the retaining wall where the security camera had a blind spot I had flagged in the original installation report, but the contractor never corrected. The service corridor entrance was exactly where Cedric described a steel door recessed behind a row of industrial dumpsters. My master key turned the old Schlage deadbolt without resistance. Inside the corridor was dark except for a green exit sign at the far end. The air smelled like machine oil and cardboard, the scent of a working freight company that moved cargo through this passage 6 days a week. I built this building to protect the company my father started. Now I was creeping through it like a thief, except the real thief had a corner office on the 2nd floor. I entered the override code on the service panel beside the freight elevator, 6 digits. No confirmation tone. The system accepted it silently. I took the east stairwell 2 flights up and emerged into the executive corridor. Emergency lighting cast pale amber across the carpet. Framed photographs of company ships lined both walls. Vessels I had inspected, certified, redesigned. My father's portrait hung near the boardroom door. I walked past it without stopping. Lorraine's office was the last door on the right. Northeast corner, harbor view. I reached for the handle and stopped. A new deadbolt sat above the original knob lock. Brass, heavy, residential grade, a Medico. The kind you put on a home safe room. Not the commercial hardware on every other door in this corridor. She hadn't installed it to keep burglars out. She had installed it to keep her own people out. A residential deadbolt on a corporate office. She didn't trust her own security team with whatever was behind this door. I pulled the tension wrench and rake pick from the tool roll in my jacket. Lock manipulation wasn't part of my engineering training. I learned it in the shipyard, where watertight compartment doors jammed regularly. And waiting for a locksmith meant losing a tide window. The Medico was harder than a marine hatch lock, but the principle was the same. Rotational pressure. Feel for the pin stack. Work each driver to the shear line. Boyd's voice came through the earpiece. 9 minutes. Anything? Working the lock, I whispered. Stand by. 90 seconds. The last pin set with a faint click and the cylinder turned. I pushed the door open. Her office smelled like leather and something floral, the perfume she wore to board meetings. Still clinging to the chair upholstery. The room was immaculate. Shelves organized by color. Desktop clear except for a lamp and a crystal paperweight shaped like an anchor. The 4-drawer steel case filing cabinet stood against the wall behind the desk. Gray steel. Keyed lock. No label. I knelt and worked the rake pick into the cabinet lock. This one was simpler. 40 seconds. The lock turned with a soft click, and the top drawer slid open. Inside, rows of manila folders stood upright, labeled with dates. 9 years of dates. And on top of the first folder, a photograph of Cedric I had never seen before. Taken in a white room with no windows, his eyes half closed. A plastic bracelet on his wrist. I picked up the photograph of my son and turned it over. On the back, in Lorraine's handwriting, the same neat cursive she used for grocery lists and birthday cards, were 6 words and 2 initials. Month 14, stable. Increased dosage per AH. 14 months into his captivity. She was annotating his condition like a livestock report. I set the photograph aside and began pulling folders. The first contained Cedric's forged intake paperwork. Patient name Gerald Fitch, date of birth March 12, 1961. She had given my son the identity of a man who would have been 64 years old enough that no nurse or orderly would question why a neurological patient couldn't remember his own past. The admission form listed the referring physician as Holloway himself. A closed loop with no outside verification. The emergency contact field was blank. The second folder held the consulting contract, a formal agreement between Prescott Maritime Freight and Pine Haven Neurological Center for monthly payments described as Crew Medical Consulting Services. The signature at the bottom belonged to a board member, not Lorraine. Someone inside the company had authorized the arrangement, had signed off on payments flowing to a facility that imprisoned a man under a false name. I photographed every page. The phone's shutter sound was off, but my hands were steady. An engineer photographs structural failures the same way: document first, react later. The third folder stopped me. A draft board resolution, printed on company letterhead, with every line filled in except the date. It authorized the permanent transfer of Cedric's majority stake to Lorraine Prescott as sole surviving beneficiary, effective upon the court's declaration. The signature block at the bottom had one name already signed, the same board member who had authorized the consulting contract. The resolution was ready. She had been waiting for the hearing the way a contractor waits for a permit. Everything built, everything in place. Just one stamp needed to make it legal. The board resolution was already typed and signed. She'd been ready to bury my son on paper the moment the judge's pen touched the page. I moved faster. Fourth folder: correspondence between Lorraine and Holloway. Handwritten notes on plain paper with no letterhead. No return address. Fifth folder: pharmacy invoices from a compounding laboratory in Springfield, listing sedative formulations by patient number rather than name. Sixth folder: annual photographs of Cedric, 1 per year, 9 total. Each annotated on the back with a month count, a status word, and a dosage instruction. 9 photographs of my son aging in a white room. His hair growing longer, his face growing thinner, his eyes growing emptier. A time-lapse of erasure, documented with the precision of an accountant tracking depreciation. Boyd's voice crackled in my earpiece. 10 minutes, Wallace, you need to move. I shoved the originals into the inner pocket of my jacket. The folders were thin enough to flatten against my chest. The photographs went into the cargo pocket of my pants. I had images of everything on my phone as backup. If the originals were lost, the digital copies would survive. If the phone was taken, the originals would survive. Redundancy, the engineer's first principle. I was reaching for the cabinet to close the drawer when I heard it. The freight elevator. The deep mechanical groan of the motor engaging, the cable pulling taut, the car beginning to rise. I knew that sound the way I knew the sound of my own breathing. I had specified the motor, approved the installation, listened to it cycle thousands of times during the years I worked in this building. The floor indicator above the corridor outside Lorraine's office began to climb. L, then 1. The elevator was coming to my floor, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was standing in the one place I could not be found. Boyd's voice, urgent now. Wallace, the lobby just lit up. Someone entered from the parking garage. Get out now. Too late, I whispered. Elevator's moving. I'm going dark. I see one vehicle, black sedan, no plates, same profile as the SUV from Saturday. I killed my flashlight, closed the cabinet drawer by feel, and backed out of Lorraine's office into the narrow storage room beside it. Cleaning supplies, a mop bucket, metal shelving stacked with printer paper. I pulled the door until only a half-inch crack remained and pressed myself against the wall. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. Footsteps on the corridor tile hard-soled shoes, unhurried, confident. Then a voice I recognized. Carlton Hewitt, 63. A company board member whose deep baritone I had heard in quarterly meetings for 2 decades. Stepped off the elevator, already talking on his phone. His overcoat swayed as he walked past the storage room door. She wants the Fitch file moved tonight, he said. All of it. Carlton Hewitt held the office door open. 2 more sets of footsteps entered. One I had slept beside for 41 years, and one I had never heard before. Through the half-inch crack in the storage room door. I watched them step into the amber light of the corridor and disappear into Lorraine's office. Her voice came first. The same voice that had read our wedding vows, that had called the Coast Guard the night our son supposedly drowned, that had wept at the memorial I now knew she had staged. "The retrieval team lost him Saturday on Route 128, Lorraine said. He had help someone was driving. They pulled off near Gloucester, and we lost the signal when the second tracker went dead." "How much does he remember?" The second voice belonged to a man I had never met, but whose name I knew from pharmacy invoices and a revoked Pennsylvania license. Dr. Eris Holloway stood a full head taller than Lorraine. I could see his silhouette through the crack. With a measured baritone and the practiced calm of a man accustomed to deciding who stays sedated and who wakes up. Tado, 7 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a dark coat buttoned to the collar, despite the heated building. "Enough to be dangerous," Lorraine answered. "The dosage error 6 months ago gave him a window. He's been lucid long enough to plan." "And the husband?" Hewitt answered that one. "Wallace hasn't asked a question in 9 years. He won't start now." She was right. For 9 years that had been true. And that was the last time she would ever be right about me. They moved into the office. I heard the filing cabinet drawer slide open, and then a pause, the drawer that I had emptied 10 minutes ago. "It's unlocked," Hewitt said. "I thought you kept this locked." "I do," Lorraine said. A longer pause. "The folders are still here. Check the count." Hewitt counted aloud. 9 folders. I had taken the originals, but left the cabinet's hanging file frames in place in the dark, with the folders pressed flat in my jacket. The drawer looked undisturbed, unless you pulled each frame forward. I had gambled on haste. For the moment, the gamble held. "All 9, Hewitt confirmed, plus the contract and the resolution draft. "Everything's here." "Good. Box them. All of it goes to the facility tonight. I don't want a single page in this building after sunrise." Holloway spoke again, and his tone shifted lower, more deliberate, the way a surgeon discusses a prognosis he already knows is terminal. "And once the hearing is done, what do we do with the boy, if we find him?" Lorraine's answer came without hesitation, without breath, without the smallest fracture in her voice. "He's not a boy anymore. Eris, he's a loose end." My wife said those words the way someone discusses canceling a subscription. "Our son. Her son. After Thursday, the shares are mine." She continued. "After that, there's no reason for him to exist on any record, anywhere. A final adjustment, cardiac failure, documented and signed. Clean." "I can manage that," Holloway said. "There are ways to make an ending look natural. No one will ever know to look twice." Before I tell you what I heard next, if you're still with me, comment 1 word for what you're feeling right now. Because this next part is a point of no return. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. They discuss the logistics the way my engineering teams used to discuss demolition schedules. Timing, sequence, documentation. Holloway would administer the overdose at the facility. Hewitt would file a death certificate through a probate-friendly physician in Springfield. Lorraine would wait 30 days. Then petition to dissolve Cedric's remaining legal identity entirely. A final erasure, as if he had never existed at all. I stood 3 feet away from the woman I had married and listened to her plan our son's murder with the same administrative precision she used to organize charity galas. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. I counted every one of them by the pulse in my throat. Then Lorraine's voice shifted brisk, efficient, wrapping up. "Carlton, there's a box of the older invoices in the storage closet. Grab those too." "Got it." Footsteps. Toward the corridor. Toward me. I pressed myself flat against the wall behind the metal shelving. The stolen documents crushed against my chest, my back touching the cold concrete. The mop bucket was to my left. The printer paper boxes were stacked to my right. There was nowhere else to go. The storage room handle rotated downward. The latch clicked free. A sliver of corridor light widened across the floor, moving toward my shoes. I held my breath. Hewitt pulled the storage room door halfway open, and then Holloway called his name from the corridor. Something about the parking garage cameras, whether they had been cycling when the sedan pulled in. The door swung shut again. The sliver of light vanished. I heard Hewitt's shoes pivot on the tile and his voice recede toward the elevator. 30 seconds. That was the window Holloway gave me without knowing it. 30 seconds bought by a question about surveillance footage, asked by the same man who had just agreed to murder my son with an undetectable compound. I waited until I heard the elevator doors close. Then I counted to 5, cracked the storage room door, and looked both ways down the corridor. Empty. The amber emergency lights hummed overhead. From the stairwell at the east end, the one I had used coming up, I heard footsteps. The night security guard, making rounds. I couldn't go back the way I came. The fire stairs were at the west end of the corridor, past the boardroom, past my father's portrait. 60 feet of open hallway with no cover. The guard's footsteps were climbing. He would reach the second floor in less than a minute. I moved. The folders inside my jacket shifted against my chest as I walked, not ran, because running makes noise, on carpeted concrete toward the far stairwell. The forged identity papers, the consulting contract, the draft board resolution, and the photographs. Those were the ones that mattered. I had left behind photocopied invoices wedged behind a filing cabinet in the storage room. 30 pages of billing records I couldn't carry without the bulk showing. I left them because in the dark, you learn what matters fast. I kept the 3 documents that prove my wife imprisoned my son and plans to kill him. The fire door had a push bar. I eased it down instead of shoving, caught the latch with my palm so it wouldn't click, and slipped into the stairwell. Concrete steps, metal railings, the smell of old paint and stagnant air. I took the stairs 3 at a time in the dark, one hand on the railing, the other pressed flat against the documents in my jacket. Boyd's voice came through the earpiece, barely above a whisper. I hear the elevator going down. They're leaving. Where are you? Fire stairs, I breathed. West side, 30 seconds. The ground floor exit opened onto a service alley that ran between the building and the harbor retaining wall. The air hit me. Salt, diesel. The cold weight of 3 in the morning on the Boston waterfront. Boyd's truck was idling 20 yards east with the headlights off. Tucked behind a dumpster enclosure, I ran. I pulled the passenger door open and was still swinging my leg inside when Boyd threw the truck into gear. The tires caught the wet asphalt and we lurched forward. The no headlights until we cleared the alley and turned onto the waterfront road. You look like you saw a ghost, Boyd said. I heard my wife plan our son's murder. She used the word resolve, the same tone she uses when a shipping contract falls through. She discussed the timing of his death the way I've heard her discuss catering schedules. Worse, I said. I heard Lorraine tell Holloway to kill Cedric after the hearing. Overdose, documented as cardiac failure. She called him a loose end. Boyd's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't speak for 4 full seconds. Then, did you get the documents? The ones that matter. Lost the invoices, kept the originals. Identity papers, the contract, the board resolution, and photographs of everything else on my phone. That sedan's moving. He glanced at the side mirror. I looked too. Behind us, a pair of headlights pulled out from the parking garage entrance, the same black sedan. No plates, brake lights flaring as it turned in our direction. We need to disappear. Take the expressway north. If they follow past the split, we'll know. He merged onto the ramp doing 60. Headlights on now. Blending into the thin pre-dawn traffic, I watched the mirror for 2 miles. The sedan didn't follow past the interchange. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something past fear. Something that had settled into my chest like a cold engine block and would not move. I pulled the documents from my jacket and spread them across my lap under the glow of the dashboard. the consulting contract, the forged intake papers, the board resolution. And underneath them all, pressed flat against my chest without my noticing, a document I hadn't seen in the dark of the filing cabinet. A second intake form, a different patient number, a different false name, a woman's name. Pinehaven had more than one prisoner. The second intake form listed a patient named Margaret Voss. Date of birth June 4, 1958. Admission date November 2020, 4 years after Cedric. The referring physician was Holloway. The emergency contact field was blank, just like my son's. I folded the form back into my jacket and told Boyd to drive to Lynn. Harlan Stanton was 69 years old, a retired pharmaceutical chemist with nicotine-stained fingers and a private laboratory in the basement of his Lynn townhouse, cluttered with equipment most universities couldn't afford. He had worked 30 years at a Boston biotech firm before retiring, and Boyd had used him as an expert witness on 2 Coast Guard toxicology cases. I trusted Boyd's judgment. Boyd trusted Harlan's science. At 7 in the morning. Harlan fed the torn medication label Cedric had smuggled out of Pinehaven into his mass spectrometer. By 14 minutes past 7, his hands had stopped moving entirely. He stared at the readout on his monitor for a long time. Then he pulled his glasses off, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on, and read it again. "This isn't sedation, Wallace," he said. "This is chemical lobotomy on an installment plan." The compound was a benzodiazepine derivative combined with a scopolamine analog, a cocktail engineered to suppress hippocampal function and block short-term memory consolidation. At the dosages printed on that label administered daily over months and years, it would cause progressive cognitive deterioration. The patient would lose the ability to form new memories, then lose access to old ones. Identity would dissolve, language would simplify. Eventually, the person receiving it would become a body without a biography. Chemical lobotomy on an installment plan. That's what a man who spent 40 years in pharmaceutical chemistry called the substance my wife paid for monthly. Like a utility bill. "This compound isn't approved for human use at any dosage." Harlan continued. "Whoever prescribed it knew exactly what it would do. There's no therapeutic justification. None. This is designed to erase a person." "But he recovered," I said. 6 months ago, the dose was wrong. A dosage error is the only reason he's standing. Another year at this level and the damage would have been permanent. Irreversible. Your son got lucky, in the narrowest sense of the word. Harlan promised a formal toxicology report by evening, notarized, formatted for court submission. Any judge who read it would understand precisely what had been done to my son. I left his lab carrying the weight of that knowledge like a lead apron. That afternoon, I drove to Brookline. Otis Langley was 66, a maritime litigation attorney who worked from a book-lined home office and had represented my family's company for over 20 years. He had handled my retirement paperwork, my father's estate, and 3 contract disputes with shipping insurers. He knew Prescott Maritime Freight from the inside. More importantly, he knew me. And when I spread the stolen documents across his dining table like evidence at a tribunal, he didn't ask how I got them. He put on his reading glasses and started reading. Boyd arrived 30 minutes later with Cedric's smuggled Pinehaven letterhead and his own Coast Guard file. The 3 of us worked through the afternoon, cross-referencing the documents against the financial records Boyd had already compiled. The pattern was surgical. Otis traced Carlton Hewitt's signature on every consulting invoice, all 108 of them, spanning the full duration of Cedric's captivity. Each one authorized a monthly payment to a facility that didn't appear in any legitimate medical directory. Each one co-signed by a board member who had no authority over crew medical matters. 108 invoices. 108 signatures. How do you write your name on a man's imprisonment that many times and still sit across from his father at quarterly meetings? "That's not negligence," Otis said, setting down the last invoice. "That's participation. Hewitt knew what he was signing. The question is what he was getting for it. Boyd had already pulled Carlton's public financial disclosures from the state ethics database. The answer was there in black and white. Unexplained quarterly deposits into a personal brokerage account, each one matching 5% of the consulting payment for that period. $3,000 a month, Boyd said. Over 9 years. That's north of $300,000. Hewitt wasn't just complicit, he was on payroll. I stared at the board resolution with Carlton's signature, the document that would have transferred everything to Lorraine in 2 days. A man I had worked beside for decades, shared meals with, trusted with the company my father built. He had signed away my son's identity 108 times and collected a fee for each one. If Carlton is in on it, I said. Who else? Otis pulled off his reading glasses and set them on the table. We need to assume nobody at that company is safe. And we need to file an emergency motion with the court before Thursday, or none of this evidence matters. Otis hit submit on the emergency motion at 6:47 p.m. Tuesday and said 3 words I will never forget. Now they know. The filing landed in the Suffolk County Court electronic docket system and triggered automatic notification to every party named in the original absent death petition. Lorraine's attorney would receive it by morning. By noon. Lorraine herself would read every word, the toxicology findings, the forged intake documents, Boyd's signal analysis, and my sworn statement describing what I heard in her office at 2 in the morning. Her name was on the filing. Holloway's name was on the filing. Carlton Hewitt's name was on the filing. She'll know by morning, Otis said, leaning back in his chair. The lamp on his desk threw a yellow circle across the scattered documents. And the moment she knows, everything changes. She's going to come after you, legally, financially, and possibly worse. You heard what she said about your son. Good, I said. Let her know. Otis studied me over his reading glasses. He had known me for 20 years through contract disputes, board reshuffles, my father's death, my retirement. He had never seen me like this, and I could tell it unsettled him. The man he remembered was measured, cautious. The kind of engineer who triple-checked load calculations before approving a weld. The man sitting across from him now had broken into a building, stolen documents, and just filed a legal motion that would detonate his marriage, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. I spent 41 years trusting Lorraine with everything. My company, my family, my grief. Now I was filing a court document that called her a kidnapper, an embezzler, and a conspirator to murder, and I did not hesitate. Otis began outlining the next steps. A formal hearing request, a motion to freeze the share transfer, subpoenas for Hewitt's financial records and Pine Haven's operating license. Boyd was running background checks on every remaining board member. Harlan's toxicology report was being formatted for submission. The machinery was moving. At 9:15 that evening, the office phone rang. Otis frowned. The number was blocked. He answered on speaker. The voice on the other end was a woman, steady, controlled, but with an undertone of exhaustion that sounded like it had been building for months. "My name is Faye Norris," she said. "I'm a former psychiatric nurse. I worked at Pine Haven Neurological Center until 6 months ago, when I was fired for adjusting a patient's medication without authorization." The room went still. Boyd set down his pen. Otis leaned toward the speaker. "I lowered his dosage," she continued. "Patient in room 114D. I'd been watching his responses for weeks. He was showing signs of cognition that the protocol was designed to suppress. I reduced the sedative by 10 milligrams. They caught it in the weekly blood panel and fired me the same day. Threatened to report me to the licensing board if I talked." Faye Norris, 44 years old, a psychiatric nurse whose steady voice carried the weight of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation for 6 months. The woman who saved my son's mind wasn't a detective or a lawyer. She was a nurse who risked her career to lower a dosage because she couldn't watch a man lose himself, one day at a time. "How did you find us?" Otis asked. "The court filing is public record," she said. "I've been checking the docket every week since they fired me, waiting for someone to file something, anything, against that facility. When I saw the name Prescott, I knew it was the patient from 114D. "Do you have documentation?" Otis pressed. "I kept copies of everything. Medication logs, shift reports, internal memos about dosage protocols. I have 6 months of records that show exactly what they were administering and at what levels. I'm willing to testify." I looked at Boyd. He nodded once. I picked up the phone and called the boathouse. Cedric answered on the second ring. I drove to Gloucester, brought him back to Brookline, and put him on the phone with Faye Norris. The silence before he spoke lasted long enough for me to hear the clock on Otis's mantle tick 3 times. "You're the one who left the fire door unlocked," Cedric said quietly. "You saved my life." "I couldn't save you while I was inside," Faye answered, "but I could make sure you had a way out." Cedric's hand was trembling when he set the phone down. I put my arm around his shoulders and felt how thin he had become. The bones too close to the surface, the muscles wasted from years of chemical stillness. 3 days, I told him. "We end this where it began, at the courthouse, with the truth." He nodded. But his hands were still shaking, and I understood what he was facing. In 3 days, my son would have to sit in a courtroom and look at the mother who tried to erase him. Lorraine knew by Wednesday morning. Her attorney called Otis before noon, demanding the emergency motion be withdrawn. By Wednesday afternoon, the judge had granted the injunction. Thursday's hearing was halted. The share transfer frozen, pending review. But we didn't wait for a rescheduled court date. We had something better. Thursday morning. The fog over Marblehead Harbor was so thick I couldn't see the end of the dock. But I could see the 4 plainclothes officers Commander Leland Greer had placed along the waterline. Greer was 52, Massachusetts State Police. A man who stood at the dock rail with the stillness of someone who had run enough operations to know that the waiting was always the hardest part. He wore a fisherman's jacket and a ball cap. And if you didn't know what to look for, you'd think he was waiting for a charter. Cedric had once told me she had people inside the department, that she had people everywhere. Watching Greer's officers move into position with quiet, disciplined precision, I understood that fear for what it really was, not evidence, but the leftover terror of 9 years spent unable to trust anyone who wore a badge. The plan had come together in 36 hours. Instead of waiting for a new hearing date weeks away, maybe months, time Lorraine would use to destroy evidence and disappear. Holloway, we would draw her to the one place she couldn't refuse: Cedric's annual memorial ceremony at the Prescott family yacht dock, every April for 9 years. Lorraine had stood on this dock with a wreath in her hands and tears on her cheeks, mourning a son who was alive in a locked room 2.5 hours west. She would come again. She always came. It was part of the performance. 9 years of memorial ceremonies at this dock. Flowers, speeches, tears. How many of those tears were real, not one of hers? Not a single one. "My officers are in position," Greer said quietly, scanning the parking lot through the thinning fog. The moment she confirms knowledge of the boy's captivity on the wire, we move. Not before. The wire was a small adhesive microphone taped beneath my collar, transmitting to a receiver in the harbormaster's office, where Boyd sat with headphones and a recording device. Everything I said, everything she said, captured in real time. Because I was a party to the conversation myself. Massachusetts law let me record my own exchange with her. Commander Greer had also secured a one-party recording authorization through the DA's office to make sure it would hold up in court. Otis had confirmed the legality twice. Otis stood near the gangway of the company's newest vessel, a 40-foot survey boat that had been commissioned 6 months ago. He carried a leather folder with copies of every document we had. Harlan's toxicology report, the forged identity papers, the board resolution, Faye Norris's medication logs, Boyd's signal analysis, backup, in case the wire failed. Cedric was below decks in the survey boat's cabin, sitting on the bunk with his hands clasped between his knees. I had brought him from Brooklyn before dawn. His withdrawal tremor had subsided to a faint vibration in his fingers, and the clarity in his eyes was sharper each day, but the fear was new. Not the fear of captivity, the fear of seeing her. "Stay below until I call your name," I told him through the cabin hatch. "When you hear it, you walk out. Let her see the sun she tried to erase." He looked up at me. "What if she doesn't react?" "She'll react. She's been controlling this story for 9 years. The one thing she can't control is you standing in front of her. Alive." I climbed back to the dock and checked my phone. 8:20. 90 minutes until she arrived, assuming she kept to her pattern. Assuming she didn't suspect anything. Assuming the woman who had fooled everyone for nearly a decade walked into the one trap she couldn't talk her way out of. The fog was lifting. Sunlight broke through in long, pale columns over the harbor, catching the mast tops of the sailboats moored along the outer pier. The water was flat and gray-green, smelling of brine and motor oil. A harbor patrol boat idled past the breakwater. Gulls circled the fish pier 200 yards south. I composed a text message on my regular phone, not the burner Boyd had given me, but the phone Lorraine knew. The phone a trusting husband would use. I kept the tone flat, normal. The voice of a man who still didn't know anything. "Heading to the dock for the memorial this morning. Will you be there?" I hit send and stood watching the fog dissolve over the water. Her reply arrived in 43 seconds. "Of course, darling. I'll bring the wreath. See you at 10. She typed those words with the same fingers that signed his intake papers. She would bring flowers to mourn the son she was planning to kill. I showed the phone to Commander Greer. He read the message, checked his watch, and nodded once. 90 minutes. In 90 minutes, the woman who had mourned her living son for 9 years would walk onto this dock for the last time. She carried the wreath like it weighed nothing. White lilies, the same kind she had chosen every year, and she smiled at me the way she always did, like a woman carrying the deepest grief in the world. Holloway walked 2 steps behind her, hands in his coat pockets, scanning the dock with the unhurried attention of a man cataloging exits. Lorraine kissed my cheek. Her perfume was the same. Her grip on my arm was the same. Everything about her was the same. And everything about what I knew had changed. "Beautiful morning, Foreign," she said softly. "He would have loved this fog." I nodded. I let her believe. She took the small podium at the dock rail, a wooden lectern the company set up every April, draped with a navy cloth bearing the Prescott Maritime crest. 30 employees and guests stood in a loose semicircle, paper cups of coffee in their hands, heads bowed. The harbor fog had thinned to a gauze that softened the mast tops and blurred the outer moorings. Gulls called from the breakwater. The air smelled like salt and lilies. Lorraine began to speak. 9 years ago, the sea took my son," she said. Her voice was clear, measured, pitched to carry across the dock without a microphone. But it could not take his memory from us. Cedric lives in every ship that carries the Prescott name, in every voyage that leaves this harbor, in every family that depends on the work we do. She paused after his name. She always paused after his name. The crowd held their breath the way crowds do when grief is on display. And she let one tear fall, always the left eye, always perfectly timed. Always just enough to prove she was still feeling it. Always the left eye. Always on cue. I had watched that tear fall 9 times and believed it every single year. I had held her hand through every one of these speeches, squeezed it when her voice broke, told her she was brave, and the whole time my son was alive in a locked room. his memory dissolving under a compound no legitimate doctor would prescribe. As Cedric's mother, she continued, I promise to protect this company and this family, as he would have wanted. His legacy is not a memorial stone. His legacy is the work we continue in his name. The crowd murmured approval. 2 employees wiped their eyes. A woman from the accounting department placed a single rose at the base of the memorial plaque bolted to the dock rail. The plaque I had commissioned in 2016, engraved with Cedric's name and the date of a death that never happened. Lorraine stepped down from the podium and accepted a hug from the office manager. She accepted another from a dock supervisor. She moved through the small crowd with the grace of someone who had practiced this ritual until it was indistinguishable from sincerity. And I sat in my folding chair in the front row with my hands clasped and the wire transmitter recording everything within 15 feet of my chest. Holloway moved through the crowd behind her. He shook hands with employees like a family friend. Easy smile, warm grip. The practiced warmth of a man who spent his professional life deciding who stayed conscious and who didn't. Nobody on this dock knew that the polite, gray-haired gentleman complimenting the memorial flowers ran a facility where people were locked in rooms and chemically erased. He moved like a surgeon at a cocktail party, calm hands, easy manner, and absolutely no conscience behind either. I tracked Commander Greer's officers without turning my head. 2 at the dock gate, standing near the coffee table in windbreakers and khakis. 2 more along the seawall. One pretending to check a mooring line, the other leaning against a piling with a phone to his ear. 4 officers, 4 positions, all within 30 seconds of the podium. The crowd began to thin. Employees drifted toward the parking lot in small groups, speaking quietly. Lorraine stood at the dock rail beside the memorial plaque, looking out at the water with the wreath resting against the railing. Holloway had moved to the far end of the dock, his phone pressed to his ear, his back to the crowd. Across the thinning group, Boyd appeared in the harbormaster's doorway. He caught my eye and gave a single nod. All positions confirmed. The wire was live. Cedric was below decks. Greer's officers were set. I stood from my chair, buttoned my jacket over the wire, and walked toward Lorraine as the last guests moved toward the gate. She turned and smiled at me, the warm, practiced smile of a woman who had no idea she had just given her last memorial speech. I took Lorraine's arm at the dock rail, leaned close the way a husband does when he wants to say something private, and said 3 words into the space between us. I know about Pinehaven. Her body went rigid. Not visibly, not in a way anyone watching would notice, but I felt it through my grip on her arm. A single contraction that traveled from her shoulder to her wrist in less than a second. Then she recovered. The mask came back. The composure she had worn for 9 years slid into place like a visor. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. Room 114D, I said. Gerald Fitch. The intake form you signed. The dosage notes in your handwriting on the back of his photographs. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her eyes cut sideways toward Holloway, who stood 20 feet away near the gangway, his phone still at his ear. I didn't give her time to signal him. I turned toward the company vessel moored at the dock and called one word across the morning air. Cedric. The cabin door opened. My son stepped into the April sunlight. He was thin. His clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone larger. The scars on his forearm were visible below his rolled sleeve, and his face carried the hollowed look of a man who had lived underground for most of a decade. But he stood straight. His eyes were clear, and when he looked at his mother, he did not look away. The dock went silent. 30 people, employees, guests, dock workers, stopped moving. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every face turned toward the gaunt figure standing on the deck of the survey boat, and then turned toward Lorraine. The memorial wreath slipped from her hand and hit the dock boards. The lilies scattered across the planks, white petals rolling toward the water's edge. 9 years of white lilies for a son who was alive the entire time. Locked in a room she paid for monthly like a storage unit. Cedric stepped off the boat and walked toward us. His gait was steady but careful. The gait of a man still rebuilding the muscles that years of chemical stillness had wasted. He stopped 5 feet from Lorraine and looked at her with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. Not anger, not hatred, something quieter and more devastating recognition. "Hello, Mother," he said. "It's been 9 years. You look surprised." Lorraine's hand went to her throat. Her lips moved a reflex, the beginning of a word that never formed. Behind her. I heard Holloway's phone clatter against the dock as he lowered it from his ear. "This isn't..." Lorraine's voice cracked for the first time without rehearsal. "Wallace, what have you done?" "What you should have done 9 years ago," I said. "I brought him home, before she could recover. Before she could find the next mask to wear." Boyd stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He carried a sealed evidence envelope in his right hand and held it up so both Lorraine and the remaining witnesses could see it clearly. "The emergency position beacon on your son's yacht was manually deactivated at 14:22 on the afternoon of his disappearance," Boyd said. His voice was the voice of a man who had delivered findings in Coast Guard hearings for 30 years flat. Precise, inarguable. "The Mayday call was placed at 15:01, 39 minutes after the beacon went dark. The marina boarding log for that morning shows 2 signatures, Cedric Prescott and Lorraine Prescott. No crew, no guests, no one else. 30 people heard Boyd read the timestamp. 30 people saw my wife's face when the numbers landed. There was no performance left to give. No rehearsed tear, no practiced pause. No single detail of the act she had perfected over 9 years that could answer the plain arithmetic of a deactivated beacon and a boarding log with 2 names. "You disabled the beacon." "Lorraine," I said. "You made sure no one could track the boat. And then you handed our son to Holloway." She stared at the evidence envelope in Boyd's hand. Her mouth was open. The dock was silent, except for the water lapping against the pilings and the distant idle of the harbor patrol boat beyond the breakwater. Then movement. Behind me, at the far end of the dock. I heard shoes on planking fast, uneven. The sound of a man who had stopped pretending. Dr. Eris Holloway broke from the crowd and ran for the parking lot. Lorraine's silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the mask changed, not shattered. Changed, and she was weeping, reaching for Cedric with both hands like a mother witnessing a resurrection. But first she tried denial. "Wallace, how could you do this?" Her voice pitched high, scandalized, the voice of a wronged wife. "This man is confused, traumatized. You're exploiting a stranger's suffering to destroy our son's memory at his own memorial." She stopped. The crowd wasn't buying it. 30 people who had worked alongside Cedric, who had attended his birthday parties and his college graduation, who had watched him grow up on this waterfront. They were staring at the man on the dock and seeing what could not be denied. The shape of his jaw, the way he stood with his weight on his left foot, the same stance he'd had since he was a teenager, the scar above his right eyebrow from a sailing accident when he was 14. This was not a stranger. So Lorraine pivoted. The accusation dissolved and the tears arrived, real tears this time. Or close enough. And she dropped to her knees on the dock planks, arms outstretched, her voice breaking into something that sounded like grief but functioned like a weapon. "Cedric, my baby. I did everything because I could not bear losing you. The sea took you, and I couldn't survive it. I couldn't let you go. You have to understand a mother's love. The sea didn't take me. Mother," Cedric said. "You did." 5 words, 30 witnesses. And every lie she had built for 9 years collapsed on a dock in Marblehead Harbor on a Thursday morning in April. Cedric did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He stood exactly where he was. 10 feet from the woman who had signed his intake papers, and spoke to the crowd with the clarity of a man who had spent 6 months rehearsing what he would say if he ever got the chance. "This woman arranged my captivity in a private facility under a false name," he said. "She paid for my sedation every month for 9 years. She hired a doctor whose license had already been revoked for drugging patients, and she instructed him to erase my memory so I could never identify her. She is not my mother. She is my captor." The doc was silent. Not the polite silence of a memorial crowd. The stunned silence of people watching a world rearrange itself in real time. The office manager who had hugged Lorraine 5 minutes ago took 2 steps backward. A dock supervisor set his coffee on a piling and didn't pick it up again. Lorraine was still on her knees. Her outstretched hands hung in the air where Cedric had refused to take them. Her face cycled through expressions like a dial searching for a frequency: grief, outrage, confusion, calculation, and settled on nothing. Behind the crowd, movement. Holloway had made it halfway to the parking lot gate when 2 of Greer's plainclothes officers closed from both sides. He tried to cut between the mooring posts toward the seawall, but the 3rd officer stepped out from behind the harbor master's office and blocked the gangway. Holloway stopped. His hands came up. The officer closest to him grabbed his wrist, turned him, and put him face down on the gangway planks. Holloway's cheek hit the wood, and the handcuffs clicked shut. The man who had erased my son's mind for 9 years was finally the one on his knees. Commander Greer stepped forward from the dock gate, badge visible on his belt, and stood over Holloway with the unhurried authority of a man who had done this hundreds of times. "Dr. Eris Holloway, you are under arrest," Greer said. "Do not move." Holloway didn't move. He lay on the gangway with his face pressed against the planking and said nothing. 2 officers lifted him to his feet and walked him toward the parking lot, where an unmarked cruiser waited. Lorraine watched the handcuffs close from her knees on the dock. I watched her watched the last calculation run behind her eyes. The final attempt to find an angle, a defense, a performance that could undo what had just happened in front of 30 witnesses and a live wire recording. She found nothing. She stood up slowly. She straightened her jacket. She lifted her chin the way she always did when she wanted the room to believe she was in control. And she said, in a voice so quiet only I and the wire could hear it, "You don't understand. None of you understand what I sacrificed." Commander Greer turned from the departing officers and walked toward her. He didn't answer. He reached for his 2nd pair of handcuffs. The handcuffs made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. A small, clean click, like a door locking from the outside. Greer closed them around Lorraine's wrists beside the podium where she had delivered 9 years of memorial speeches. And she did not resist. She stood with her back straight and her chin raised, and she turned to me with a look that was neither rage nor sorrow. It was calculation, even now. With steel on her wrists and her co-conspirator already in the back of a cruiser, she was measuring what could still be salvaged. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "When the company falls apart without me, you'll understand everything I did was for this family." I looked at the woman I had married 41 years ago. The woman who had organized fundraisers and hosted board dinners and stood at this podium every April with lilies in her arms. The woman who had signed a forged intake form, authorized monthly payments to a prison, annotated photographs of our sedated son with dosage instructions, and discussed his murder over a filing cabinet at 2 in the morning. "You locked our son in a room for 9 years and called it sacrifice," I said. "There's nothing left to understand." She held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then Greer's officer took her arm and walked her toward the parking lot. She passed the scattered lilies on the dock boards, white petals crushed under boot soles, stems broken. The wreath she had carried like a prop for the last hour of the last performance she would ever give. They walked her past the memorial plaque, past the podium, past the folding chairs where employees had bowed their heads minutes ago. The lilies from the wreath stuck to the soles of the officers' boots as they guided her across the dock. And she didn't look down at them. She didn't look back at me, or at Cedric. She looked straight ahead, the way she always did when she wanted the world to believe she was above whatever was happening around her. Greer spoke into his radio. "Transport them separately. No communication between suspects. Notify the DA's office we're adding conspiracy to commit murder to the charges." 2 cruisers, Holloway in the first, already pulling out of the parking lot. Lorraine in the second, the door closing behind her with the solid thud of institutional steel. Through the rear window, I could see her profile, upright, composed, staring forward, performing for an audience that no longer existed. The cruisers turned onto the harbor road and disappeared past the breakwater. The parking lot emptied. The employees who had witnessed everything drifted away in small groups, speaking in low voices or not speaking at all. Within 10 minutes, the dock was empty except for the scattered flowers, the folding chairs, and 2 men standing at the rail. Cedric and I stood where the memorial wreath used to hang every April. The harbor stretched out in front of us, flat water, thin sunlight, the smell of brine and diesel, and the faint sweetness of crushed lilies on warm planking. A lobster boat motored past the channel markers. A gull landed on the nearest piling and watched us with one yellow eye. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I held my son on a dock where I had mourned him every April for 9 years. The harbor smelled exactly the same. The water moved the same way against the pilings. The light fell at the same angle it always fell in mid-morning in spring. Everything around us was identical to every memorial morning I could remember. And everything else in the world was different. Cedric put his hand on the dock rail, the same rail I had gripped during every ceremony, knuckles white. Holding on while Lorraine spoke, and the crowd wept, and the lilies sat in their wreath like a crown on a grave that didn't exist. I put my hand beside his. Our fingers were 3 inches apart on the weathered wood. He leaned into my shoulder, and I put my arm around him, and I held him. His bones were too close to the surface. His frame was too thin. But he was warm, and he was breathing, and he was here. "Is it over?" he asked. "The arrest is over," I said. "The rest is going to take time." "I have time now," he said. That's the part I'm still getting used to. We stood there until the dock was empty, and the harbor went quiet. Then Boyd walked over from the harbor master's office with his phone in his hand and a look on his face I hadn't seen before. Something between relief and urgency. "Commander Greer just called," he said. "They're raiding Pine Haven tonight. They found the second patient. She's still alive." The trial lasted 11 days. But the moment I will remember forever took less than 3 seconds. The jury foreman reading the word guilty 3 times in a row. Once for each defendant. The syllables dropping into the courtroom like stones into still water. But before the trial, there was the raid. State police hit Pine Haven that Thursday night with a warrant and a tactical team. Cedric and I watched the news footage from Otis's living room in Brookline helicopters. Officers in body armor moving through a converted farmhouse in the Berkshire Hills. They found Margaret Voss behind the second locked door at the end of the corridor, the one Cedric had never seen opened. They found 3 more. 3 additional patients held under false identities in a wing Cedric never knew existed. A locked corridor behind the second door his orderlies had guarded on rotation. 3 more families who had buried someone who was still breathing. My wife's crime wasn't personal. It was a business model. Holloway had been running a warehouse for the disappeared, and Lorraine had been his anchor client. The case went federal. Racketeering charges layered on top of kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and embezzlement. The prosecution assembled its evidence like an engineer assembles a structure, one load-bearing element at a time. Each one tested before the next was placed. Harlan's toxicology report proved the drugs were designed to destroy memory. Boyd's signal analysis proved the beacon was sabotaged. Faye Norris took the witness stand and testified for 4 hours about dosage protocols, shift logs, and the night she lowered Cedric's medication because she couldn't watch another patient lose himself. The forged documents spoke for themselves. Hewitt's financial records traced every payment. Then the prosecution played the wire recording. The courtroom heard my wife's voice, calm, precise, undeniable, saying the words I had heard through a storage room door at 2 in the morning. There's no reason for him to exist on any record, anywhere. The gallery went silent. The defense attorney closed his eyes. Lorraine sat in the defendant's chair and did not move. Cedric testified on the 7th day. He sat in the witness box in a suit that still hung loose on his frame and spoke for 2 hours about the room, the drugs, the years he lost, the name he couldn't remember, the paperclip he used to carve a number into his own arm so he wouldn't forget he was real. He did not cry. His voice did not shake. He looked at his mother once, early in his testimony, and she looked back at him with an expression I couldn't read. And then he turned to the jury and said the words that would appear in every newspaper the following morning. I lost 9 years. I lost my 20s. I lost the ability to remember my own name. She paid to make sure I never got any of it back. Lorraine sat through every word without expression. Not guilt, not defiance, nothing. As if the trial were happening to someone else, in a language she didn't speak, about a person she didn't recognize. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Every charge, every defendant. Lorraine received 25 years for kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering. A federal sentence with no parole. She will be 90 before she's served enough of it to request early release for good conduct. My son will be 56. The math of stolen time never balances. You can punish the thief, but you cannot return what was taken. Holloway received 30 years. His prior record in Pennsylvania ensured the maximum. He showed no reaction when the sentence was read. Carlton Hewitt received 12 years for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. He wept. He was the only one of the 3 who did. The judge turned to Lorraine before the final order. Mrs. Prescott, do you wish to address the court before sentencing is entered? Lorraine stood. She straightened her jacket, the same gesture she had made on the dock, the same reflex of control she reached for when everything else was gone. She looked at me. She looked at Cedric sitting beside me in the gallery, her mouth opened. Nothing came out. She stood there for 4 seconds in absolute silence. And then she sat down. The bailiff took her arm. She was led through the side door without looking back. The courtroom emptied slowly. Lawyers gathered files. Reporters filed into the corridor. The gallery cleared row by row until it was just Cedric and me sitting in the 3rd row, staring at the empty defendant's chair where my wife of 41 years had just been sentenced to die in prison. I waited to feel something. Relief, grief, vindication, anything. There was nothing. Just silence where a marriage used to be. And the faint smell of floor polish in a room where justice had been done and nothing had been repaired. The emptiness followed me out of the courthouse and into the weeks that came after. I slept at Otis's house in Brookline, then at a hotel near the waterfront, then at the boathouse in Gloucester where the whole thing had started. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The house in Marblehead was still full of her coats in the closet, her handwriting on the kitchen calendar, her perfume trapped in the curtains. I wasn't ready for that. How do you give a man back 9 years of his life? You can't. But you can start with a piece of paper worth $42 million. Otis called us to his dining table on a Tuesday afternoon, the same table where we had first spread the stolen documents under lamplight, the same room where Faye Norris's voice had come through the speakerphone and changed everything. This time the table held a single folder. Court-ordered share transfer, Otis said, opening it. 51% controlling interest in Prescott Maritime Freight, restored to Cedric Wallace Prescott. Effective immediately. He set the document in front of Cedric and placed a pen beside it. Additionally, 2 banking institutions that processed the fraudulent consulting payments without due diligence have settled. $3.2 million in compensation, deposited into a trust account pending your signature. Cedric stared at the document. He didn't pick it up. He didn't reach for the pen. He sat in the same chair where he had listened to Faye's testimony preparation weeks earlier, his hands flat on the table, and looked at the words on the page the way a man looks at a door he isn't sure he's allowed to open. "I was 22 when she took this from me," he said. "I didn't even understand what shares were. I didn't understand what any of it meant, the board votes, the company structure, the inheritance. I was a kid who liked boats and thought the business would always be there." He was 22 when they took the shares. He's 31 now. 9 years of compound interest on a life she stole. Promotions he never received, decisions he never made, relationships he never built. No settlement covers that. No court order restores the decade between 22 and 31. The years when a man is supposed to fail and learn and become someone. Those years were spent in a white room with no windows, under a name that wasn't his, with a compound dripping into his bloodstream that was designed to make sure he never remembered any of it. "You don't have to understand it today," I told him. "You just have to know it's yours, and nobody can take it again." Otis excused himself to make coffee. I heard him in the kitchen, running water, opening cabinets, giving us the room the way a good attorney knows when the law is finished and the family needs to talk. Cedric looked at me across the table. "I want to learn the business," he said. "Not as an owner, as an apprentice, the way Grandpa taught you." My father had started on the loading dock in 1962. He drove forklifts for 2 years before he touched a manifest. He learned the shipping routes by riding the vessels, learned the finances by sitting in on meetings he wasn't supposed to attend, learned the engineering by watching structural inspections until the inspectors let him hold the instruments. By the time he ran the company, he knew every bolt and every hull. "Your grandfather started on the loading dock," I said. "Are you sure?" "I spent 9 years in a room with no choices. I want to start from the ground up, because this time, it's mine." His hands shook when he picked up the document. But it wasn't the tremor I had seen at the boathouse. The withdrawal shake. The involuntary vibration of a nervous system fighting its way clear of years of chemical suppression. This different. This was a man learning to hold something without expecting it to be taken away. He read every line. He read the court seal, the judge's signature, the legal description of the shares, the effective date. He read his own name, printed in the ownership field. His real name, not the one they had given him at Pine Haven, and his jaw tightened the way mine does when I'm trying not to let something show. Then he folded the document carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same pocket where he had hidden the torn medication label the night he escaped. The last piece of paper he carried in that pocket had saved his life. This one was giving it back. "Loading dock," he said. "Monday." I nodded. And for the first time since the courthouse, I felt something move in the place where the silence had been. Cedric started at the loading dock that Monday, and for the first weeks it looked like the beginning of something good. He learned the manifest system, shadowed the dock supervisors, asked questions about tonnage and routing that reminded me of my father. But the recovery was never a straight line. The worst days were the ones when he looked at me across the breakfast table and didn't know who I was. I had finally gone back to the Marblehead house, cleared out Lorraine's things in a single afternoon, filled 14 boxes, drove them to a storage unit I would never visit, and moved Cedric into the guest room so I could be there when the bad mornings came. And came. The neurologist at Mass General warned us that years of hippocampal suppression would leave gaps, some permanent, some recoverable, all unpredictable. On good days, Cedric was sharp, curious, present. On bad days, he woke in a panic, convinced he was back in the facility, convinced the orderlies were coming, convinced the walls were closing. One Tuesday in July, he sat across from me at breakfast and stared at my face for 30 seconds before speaking. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was careful, embarrassed, the voice of a man trying to hide something he couldn't control. "I know your face, but I can't find your name."
"It's right there and I can't reach it."
"It's Dad," I said. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had reconnected. I could see it happen. The way you see a circuit complete when a breaker is thrown. And he said my name and exhaled, and neither of us mentioned it again that morning. I attended every therapy session, every cognitive assessment, every follow-up at the neurologist's office where they measured his recall, his pattern recognition, his ability to hold a sequence of numbers for longer than 90 seconds. Some weeks the results improved, some weeks they didn't. The therapist told me privately that full recovery was unlikely, but meaningful recovery was possible. And every month that passed without the compound in his system gave his brain more room to rebuild. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in September, something shifted. We were sitting on the back porch after a session, drinking coffee. Not talking about anything in particular. The harbor was visible through the trees. The same view I'd looked at for 40 years. The same water, the same light. "You took me to the Gloucester docks when I was 7, Cedric said. I set my cup down. There was a red fishing boat tied up at the end. You lifted me onto the deck and let me ring the bell. I rang it 11 times, and you pretended to be annoyed." He remembered the sound of me laughing before he remembered my name. That's what the drugs couldn't erase. Not facts, not dates, not the architecture of a life. But the feeling of being loved. The compound had stripped away everything it could reach. And underneath all of it, at the bottom of whatever was left, was a 7-year-old boy ringing a bell on a fishing boat while his father laughed. "You remember that?" I asked. "I remember you laughing," he said. "That's what came back first, the sound of you laughing." We both cried before either of us realized it was happening. The months after that were different. Not easier different. The bad mornings still came, but they came less often. The gaps narrowed. Cedric moved from the loading dock to the operations office, then to the fleet management division. He asked questions I didn't expect and understood answers I didn't think he was ready for. The business was in his blood the way it had been in my father's. Not as ambition, but as instinct. The way some people understand water and wood and steel without being taught. Nearly a year after the arrest, on a morning in early spring, we stood together at the Prescott family yacht dock. The memorial plaque was gone. I had removed it myself in November, pried it off the rail with a flathead screwdriver and dropped it in the harbor. In its place, a christening platform held a newly built survey vessel, 42 feet, the company's first new commission under Cedric's name. The dock where I had laid wreaths for 9 years now held a ship that had never carried a lie. Same wood, same harbor, same salt air, everything different. Cedric stepped onto the deck and put his hand on the helm. He looked back at me on the dock and said 3 words. "This time, I steer." I nodded. And I let go of the rail, the same rail I had gripped at every memorial for 9 years, and for the first time. I didn't need to hold on to anything. I watched the new vessel clear the harbor mouth with my son at the wheel. And something inside me that had been clenched for a year longer, for 9 years, for a decade of grief built on a lie, finally let go. Not all at once, not dramatically. It loosened the way a mooring line loosens when the tide shifts. Quietly, without anyone noticing. The morning Cedric walked into Prescott Maritime Freight headquarters as its rightful owner, he wore the same shoes he had escaped Pinehaven in. Scuffed leather, worn soles. The laces replaced with cord from the boathouse. I never told him I noticed. Some things a father keeps to himself. The boardroom ceremony was small, 8 remaining board members. Otis standing by the door in case anything needed a legal signature. Boyd leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed and something close to a smile on his face. The chair where Carlton Hewitt used to sit was empty. Nobody mentioned it. Cedric stood at the head of the table, in a suit that finally fit him. He had gained back 12 pounds since the fall, and the hollows in his face had begun to fill, and addressed the room without notes. "My name is Cedric Prescott," he said. "Some of you thought I was dead. I'm not, and this company is going to remember the difference." He didn't stumble over a single word. The man who couldn't remember my name 6 months ago just commanded a boardroom without a tremor in his voice. The board members stood and applauded. And I sat in the back row, not as a chairman, not as an engineer, not as an executive, as a father. And I realized I had nothing left to fix. If you've made it this far into my story, you already know the hardest part wasn't the chase, the break-in, or the arrest. The hardest part was the morning he didn't recognize my face. And I had to introduce myself to my own son. Everything else, the evidence, the wire, the courtroom was engineering, solving a problem with the tools available. But sitting across a breakfast table from a man who shares your blood and watching him search for your name in a place the drugs had emptied, that was the thing that nearly broke me. And the thing that made everything else worth doing. That afternoon, Cedric drove us both to Marblehead Harbor. "Come on, Dad," he said. "One more trip before sunset." We boarded the new vessel, and he took the wheel. The engine caught on the first turn. He throttled out past the breakwater, past the mooring field, past the channel markers where lobster boats rocked in the late afternoon swell. The air tasted like salt and diesel, and the faint green smell of open water warming in spring. He turned south. I didn't ask where we were going. I already knew. The GPS on the console ticked through coordinates as we motored into deeper water, numbers climbing, latitude shifting. The harbor shrinking behind us into a line of rooftops and mast tips. The GPS ticked through the coordinates where my son was supposed to have died 9 years ago. Nothing there now. Just water, doing what water does, moving forward, carrying nothing it doesn't need. Neither of us spoke as the numbers passed. The water was calm. The sun sat low and orange over the western shore. A pair of terns crossed our bow heading north. Cedric held the wheel steady and looked out at the empty ocean. The same water where a Mayday call was placed 39 minutes after a beacon went dark. The same water where the Coast Guard searched for a body that was never there. "I used to dream about the ocean," he said. "In Pine Haven, I could hear waves that weren't there. At night, when the drugs were wearing off, I'd hear them through the walls, this rushing sound, like surf. The orderly said it was the ventilation system, but I knew it wasn't. That was a memory trying to come home. Sometimes, ships don't sink from storms. They sink because someone inside opens the drain valve someone trusted. Someone with access. Someone who knows the vessel well enough to destroy it from within. But this ship held. This one was built on something the saboteur couldn't reach. The sun touched the waterline. The harbor lights of Marblehead flickered on behind us, one by one, like a sentence being written in the dark. Cedric held the wheel steady. The Kraus goods facing open water. I sat in the stern with salt air on my face and the sound of the engine beneath me, and my son alive at the helm. Some mornings begin with a knock on the door that changes everything. And if you're lucky, if you fight hard enough. If you don't look away, the story doesn't end at sea. It ends on the horizon. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 9 years trusting the wrong person with the most important thing in my life. I never questioned the grief she handed me. I never looked at the data. I never once asked why the numbers didn't add up. Because I loved her. And love made me blind. Don't make my mistake. Don't let loyalty become a reason to stop paying attention to the people you care about most. This was never meant to be a revenge story. I didn't set out to destroy my wife or tear down what we built together. I set out to save my son. But somewhere along the way, I learned that the truth doesn't wait for you to be ready. It arrives on its own schedule. And what you do with it defines who you become. I believe God put me through those 9 years for a reason I may never fully understand. But the lesson is one I can pass on. Trust the people who show you who they are through their actions, not their words. And if something feels wrong, if the numbers don't match, if the tears fall too perfectly, if the grief feels rehearsed, look closer. Every revenge story people hear is really a story about someone who finally looked closer. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done differently? Would you have looked at the data sooner? Share this with someone who needs to hear it, a friend, a parent. Anyone who's ever trusted too deeply and paid the price. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Every revenge story I share here carries a lesson worth hearing twice. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time and your presence mean more to me than you know. Please remember that certain details in this story were adapted for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. The message, that's what I hope, stays with you.